computer. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody to this salon on, this is number 4 in the Beyond Prison series from Beyond Return. And today we're going to be talking about the emergence of social order in prisons. So Beyond Return is a collective endeavor aimed at shifting our collective sense of common sense, what we should be striving for. The collective sort of formed at the beginning of the pandemic in seeing that our collective sense of what was possible just completely was blast open. We started to see things that everybody had been striving for but sort of thought was impossible start to happen. We started to see hotels housing the homeless. We started to see people being paid to stay at home and look after themselves and all sorts of things. And so things that people like my dad might have thought were completely impossible a year ago suddenly are part of like what is completely seen as an acceptable thing to strive for. And so we assembled together at the beginning of the pandemic, thinking, let's lean into this moment and really think about how do we help shift the idea of what's sensible to strive for as a species. And oh, sorry, Alison sent me a message. When you record on the computer, it records everyone unless you spotlight the speaker. What do I do? You tell me.
I don't know if that's the case, but I think in my previous recordings, whenever I recorded on the computer, it recorded everyone, like the mosaic of people, unless you spotlight the speaker.
Okay.
If you want to spotlight Danilo, sorry, this is a boring admin thing.
No, we love admin.
You have to spotlight his presentation, otherwise you'll see everyone, which is also fine in case you intend that.
Great. Okay, that's great. Thank you. That's wonderful. So we sort of got together at the beginning of the pandemic and we crowdsourced 2 sets of aspirations, which are here. And the idea was to think like, what is it that we want people, in a generation's time to just think this is a completely common sense to think about. And the way I sort of think of it is like, when Miss America gets up on stage and they're just like, hi, I just want world peace. How do we shift? So that in a generation's time, Miss America is like, I want closed loop economies that account for all negative externalities, or whatever. And so that's the idea. And, much of this is taking place in cultural shift. This is where things really begin, where we start to open up what's possible in the everyday person's eyes. So one of our aspirations is systems of justice that center on harm prevention and the promotion of care, rehabilitation, and education that does not seek to respond to violence with violence. This is one of our 10, and of course, seeking a world beyond prisons is part of our sort of strategy of thinking about how we might get there. And so today we're focusing on that, and it's really amazing to have Danilo here. So Danilo is a political scientist and data analyst from Sao Paulo. They have a PhD in political economy from King's College London, and they are going to talk to us about some of the work they've done studying the emergence of social order in prisons. I think they have 20 minutes worth roughly of slides, and then we're going to open up for discussion. So let me see if I go spotlight you. I think you can share your slides and okay. I will mute, and everybody else feel free to ping questions and discussion in the chat. And we'll keep them for later on.
Okay, can you guys see it? Right? Can you see it here, like the slides? I hope so. Oops. Okay, there we go. So, thanks everyone. Thanks Exorina for inviting me. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm very, very happy to see all of you here. And I'm very sure that we're gonna have a very interesting discussion today. So indeed, my topic's about the prison abolition in general. I'm going to mention prison gangs quite a lot and vigilante groups a bit as well, because that's what I'm currently working on. But let me just go and summarize it. So here we have like a few things. Of course, if you want to contact me, I'm going to let the slides online. So please feel free to download them later to get them at any time. Okay. So why am I outside to the prison abolition debate? So first of all, I'm not from a developed country where that's where the discussion has been taking place. So at least as far as I can see, most of the discussion about prison abolition comes from the US. and of course, up to a certain extent from Scandinavia and from the UK, but there's very little discussion about it in the developing countries. So like we might have a different perspective that we can share as well. I've never been a prisoner, and I've never worked in the criminal justice system. I've worked together with the police in some parts, and I've done quite a bunch of interviews with former inmates and gang members, but I've never been one of those. Okay, so I just see them from an outsider's point of view. I'm an empiricist, and I'm a quantitative methodologist. So usually I count things. So it's very surprising for me to be talking about this very long project with very bold and aspirational ideas. So I'm always focused on say like minor things that we can like, tweak here and there and maybe change a bit. So it's very nice to be able to talk about something big. I'm a bit skeptical, indeed, of some claims that prison abolitionists have made. And of course, we're going to talk more about this later. That's one of the topics of this talk, together with, again, the emergence of order, which is, of course, related with the idea of prisons. And I'm a strong supporter of prison reform, indeed, like strongly. And again, we can talk about that during the discussion to say what I think a bit more about it and what you guys think about that too. I'm very interested in hearing that from you. But I'm very new to the prison abolition literature, so I'm always open for another point of view. Okay, again, as I said, however, I like to meet people with bold and original ideas, so that's why I'm here this afternoon in Brazil. I do think we need some like moonshot projects, like very long projects, and things that we can say like try to project how the future would be and what we can do about that. And I truly believe that open debates with people who you disagree with are underrated and are super necessary. And at least in my experience, they're becoming slightly rare. And I kind of lament that things are this way in this moment. I'm very open to change my mind when I'm faced with compelling arguments or with compelling evidence. So, so if you have different points of view that you would like to share with me, again, I'm very open to all that. And once more, I'm really thankful for the invitation, and I hope to learn from you all today. Thanks very much for that. Okay, so brief outline. Again, the presentation is going to be very short, about like 20, 25 minutes. So then we can have like plenty of time for discussions, for Q&A and all that. So I'm just going to give like a very brief overview of what a prison abolition is. So now I know that you guys are very familiar with the subject, so I'm going to go very quickly through this part. Okay, so I thought, well, maybe we have a very diverse audience who might not be familiar. So that's why I prepared the 1 or 2 slides about that. Then we have three skeptical takes on a prison abolition. And my main point is what can prison gangs and mob violence and vigilant groups teach us about incarceration? Okay, so then a few suggestions, which I think that might be useful on how to move the discussion forward. And lastly, we have plenty of time for Q&A. Okay, that's the brief outline for today. So let's get started. So like the case for prison abolition. So let's start with that. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly because again, I believe that you are all very familiar with this. So I'm just going to go briefly. Okay, so contemporary discussions to abolish prisons, they started in Scandinavia with Thomas Mathiesen, which is a Norwegian scholar, and with Ostrom, who wrote this, a very interesting book in 1976, mostly talking about the American experience with incarceration. So we have many problems around like this time in the 70s. We had the Attica prison revolt and many other problems with prisons, which fostered this discussion about prison abolitionism. Why don't we just go and abolish incarceration the way it is? Okay, so most scholars which advance for prison abolition currently take the American prison system as an example, which is, of course, strongly racist in many ways, very biased against minorities in many senses. So then the discussion nowadays has largely shifted to problems of the American prison complex. So then we have here, of course, like the great Marshall Project, who has been doing some interesting discussions about that. Okay, so of course I'm giving very, very broad strokes and have a very bird's eye view. But at least as far as I understand it, we can summarize the position in about 5 points. The prison abolitionists' positions in about 5 points. First is that the prison industrial complex is the modern equivalent of slavery. Why? Because it is again like racist towards minorities. It has been used to strengthen the capitalist regime. That's the second point. Okay, so that's why the language is very much similar. Talk about like abolitionism. Okay. Third point: the resources they use to maintain prisons should be spent elsewhere, mainly in welfare or say other types of provisions for people who are in need. So then they have much better gains in this respect. So the societal benefits are much stronger. Okay. So the fourth point: local communities can and they should be responsible for public safety. So why should we trust the federal government to protect us if we have better information about crimes and about the motivation of the agents than a bureaucrat in a distant city may have? Okay, so local communities should and can be responsible for that. And the last part is that the criminalization does not address the needs of the interest parties. So for instance, if someone, say, like, is stealing because he or she is in a very bad economic situation, like criminalizing this behavior does not address the root question, okay, the root cause of the crime, so to speak, which is economic need. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of these 5 points. If I'm not mistaken, that's how it is. So abolitionism is attracting large interest in the mainstream media. For instance, it has appeared in Vanity Fair, GK, and the New York Times, The Nation, NPR, Teen Vogue, and many, many other outlets. So there's also strong literature on this topic, a very a burgeoning one. So we have about 3,000 articles which have prison abolition in the title, according to Google Scholar, which is quite a substantial number for such a young strand of literature, I believe. So in the wake of recent episodes of racial violence in America, there has also been a surge in social media posts about that. So if you just follow, say, like the prison abolition hashtag on Twitter, you're going to find, again, thousands and thousands of posts. So I'm happy that the movement is gaining traction, indeed. And my point is, okay, so how can we discuss prison abolitions? How can someone offer a healthy, skeptical point of view and discuss some of the problems that the literature has in using, again, other societies as examples? So like my first take is that there are crimes in inverted commas, but there are also serious crimes, and we need to address them, indeed. And my second take is there is a supply for harsh punishment because there is a strong demand for it. And that's a very inconvenient truth that we sometimes face, say like in sociology, criminology, or in political science, that there is a demand for that as well. Not only say like a top-down supply of violence, but there's a bottom-up demand for it. And then that's something we have to discuss seriously, I believe. And my third take, there's little empirical evidence that prison abolitionism works, although I think it might. Whereas other public policies that might reduce incarceration, such as deterrence, they show like better results. And I think that we should incorporate that into the debate as well, together with this novel goal of prison abolitionism. Okay, so let me go into like further detail what I mean about that. One of the problems with prison abolitionism is that it's very hard to test them empirically. Why? Well, because there has never been a case where prisons have been completely abolished. So we can only imagine how a society without prisons would be, but it's very hard to figure out how indeed it would be because we have no close approximations. Okay, so I think that if we want to engage the public or more policymakers into this debate, we may need more empirical evidence, even if it's not a direct one. So, of course, randomized experiments in this regard are unethical, they are illegal to a large extent, and they are probably very unpopular. It's going to be very hard for the federal government of any country to say, well, we're releasing half of the prisoners, we're not releasing the other half, and we're going to see what happens in 5 or 10 years. So no politician is willing to incur in such risks because politicians are mostly risk averse. Okay, so it's going to be hard. So like my point was, okay, so how can we approximate how a world without prisons would be? One way of doing so is to look at communities in which incarceration is unfeasible, right? And in many places, the state is either unable or unwilling to act. And then here I'm going to talk about two relevant cases: prison gangs and vigilante groups. Most about prison gangs, I should say, but a bit about vigilantes as well. So prison gangs, paradoxically, are indeed one of such cases where the state is unwilling or unable to act, because they are created to regulate inmate affairs. They are beyond the scope of the state. The inmates live in such harsh conditions where access to goods is so limited that they need to organize themselves a type of underground economy in which they can share a barter or bargain to have access for the goods that they have outside of the prison walls. Okay, so many things which are very easy for us that we take for granted, such as say, soap, toothpaste, a chocolate bar, sometimes a cigarette, a beer, things we take for granted, are extremely difficult to get in prisons. So they have to organize themselves and get the goods that they want to. And of course, I'm not also talking about other illegal goods, which of course mainly drugs or sex and other things. So, and apart from prison gangs, most developing countries have areas in which the state has only a very imperfect monopoly of force, if they have any monopoly of force at all. So vigilante groups themselves are in charge of punishing criminals and enforcing the law. In both cases, incarcerating individuals is not an option, either because they have already been incarcerated, okay, so you cannot restrict their freedom of movement to further, or because there are simply no prisons, which is the case in many developing countries. Okay, so of course that's an example of a prison gang, which everyone might have seen earlier. So that's a prison in Central America. Okay, that's the 18, which is a gang. It's very powerful in some countries in Central America, and extremely overcrowded conditions, as you might see. And every fieldwork that I have done in Sao Paulo with prison gangs, the prisons are exactly like this one. You see extremely overcrowded conditions where the state is simply completely unwilling to act. So prison guards, at least in Brazil or in Bolivia or in Mexico, in some places which I have read more about or I have visited myself, prisoners have to enforce their own rules. And obviously, incarceration is not an option because they're already there. So how do they enforce rules? And what can they teach about prisons, indeed? So, and the other group I'm going to talk about are vigilantes. Vigilantes are far more common than we see, and they are mainly responsible for probably from 25 to 30% of deaths in many countries, including in Brazil. So in Brazil, we have about one lethal lynching episode every 2 days, even during the pandemic, and we have around 550 episodes in the last year, which is more than one every 2 days, which is not only the highest number in the history of the country, but it's also the highest number in the world, as far as we know. So like vigilante groups are not only a threat that we imagine, say, in rural parts of Texas, but they are indeed a problem in many countries. Okay, so in America, for instance, vigilantes have limited authority because they compete directly with the state. We have this legal pluralism when we have many different sources of power. But in some Latin American countries, they are the only source of power. Here we call them militias as well, and they are, by at least concerning the best evidence we have, they are one of the main supporters of the current president, Jair Bolsonaro. So his family is closely tied with militia groups in Rio. Okay. So again, using those as examples, let's see how they tackle these questions that I had posed in the beginning. First, we have crimes and crimes. So we have crimes with inverted commas, which the literature sometimes points out to question the validity of the accusations. In most of the cases, that's absolutely correct. So most people would agree that drug possession, for instance, or traffic infractions, or a very, very minor crime, say like motivated by economic fragility, they should not be punished with incarceration. And even if you survey the public overall, most people strongly believe that this type of incarceration is too harsh. However, how would prison abolitionists deal with serious crimes? So like the ones which society largely believed they are strongly immoral, say for instance, gang rape, child pornography, cannibalism, so serious crimes. At least from what I could see in the prison abolitionism literature, that's one of the parts which I would say that it was hard for me to get convinced, because not all crimes are motivated by, say, like racism or capitalism per se, although many are, but some are not. And how can we justify prison abolitionism, say, like for a cannibal, or someone who shares child pornography, or someone who engages in gang rape? So that's difficult to justify. Again, we can talk about more about that in the Q&A, but that's one of the questions. So, and how do those societies, how gangs and how vigilante groups, how do they deal with that? Okay, where incarceration is impossible. So prison gangs have very strict codes of behavior, often in the form of written constitutions, right? So prison gangs write what you can and you cannot do. And this is common knowledge to pretty much every gang member. There was not a single gang member that I ever talked to who was not aware of the regulations, of what they had to do and what they were forbidden to do. So punishment for serious crimes in most of the prison gangs is death. So in some cases, such as the Japanese mafia, for instance, they have other types of punishment. For instance, they usually have like mutilations, when they chop off the fingers or the hands, so on. But for serious crimes, such as rape, the punishment is usually death. It's pretty much common like everywhere. Say like child molesters have a very tough time in prisons, very, very tough time in prisons. So some prison gangs, again, like Brazil's Primeiro Comando, which is Portuguese for the first command, they also have crime courts. And so the accusers, they can actually discuss with criminals what the punishment would be, and then the accused can also defend themselves in many ways, and exactly as a regular court. But the punishment is still very violent, and more than 70 or 80% of punishment is death, okay, for the person who's involved. So the prison gangs also use communicative violence. So they also use violence as a means of communication. So you do not kill just because the person deserves to be killed for the crime that he or she has done, but it sends a message to others. It serves as a signal. It's a costly signal, because killing someone who's a member of your own gang is costly, because you lose someone from your own group, which you have invested money on, which you have gained access to, and which has given you information and all that. So it's costly for the gang to kill a member, but you have to do it because it sends a signal to the other ones. Okay, so violence does not have only an strictly utilitarian sense, in the way that it's only served to punish offenders, but it also serves as a means of communication, which is also something which I believe poses a question for prison abolitionists, because if violence serves not only the purpose of punishing the criminal, but if it serves the purpose of cleaning some of the sins that they have in the society, indeed in this metaphysical sense, so they're indeed very, very hard to overcome. Okay, so how do vigilante groups deal with that? So they vary greatly in scope and size, as I mentioned in the beginning. So in developing countries, lynchings are the most common form of vigilante punishment. Most of them lead to death, as I said. From 2011 to 2015, we had about 2,500 killing episodes. And in 2015 alone, 170 people were killed by angry mobs, just by angry mobs. And I'm not mentioning other types of extralegal violence. So an average of one execution every 2 days, indeed. Victims are generally accused of petty theft, and many are beaten to death for stealing mobile phones, cooking utensils, or even pairs of sandals. Lynching perpetrators are often young men, but they also include female teenagers, elderly women, and even members of the local police force. Okay, so when the state is not present, vigilante groups will take over, and they're usually much, much more violent than the state itself. Even in a very violent place like Brazil, where the state is definitely known for its brutal tactics, indeed. Okay, so again, my second point was the supply and the demand for punishment. So lynchings happen more often where the police is unreliable, unavailable, or people distrust the criminal justice system for being too lenient with criminals. That's probably the most interesting finding that I got when I was doing research in Mexico, is that democratization leads to higher support for lynchings, not for lower support, but for higher. And then the reason was, if you interview people, they argue that because of human rights and because of civil rights in many senses, the police cannot arrest criminals anymore, so they cannot go to prison. So they stay on the streets for very long, threatening the society. So what they believe is that the more democratic the country is, the more legitimate lynchings are. So that's a very puzzling question indeed, but which I face time and again. I'm running an experiment about lynching attitudes in Brazil right now, and we have already found exactly the same pattern. So people support lynchings because they think that Brazil is too democratic, not too authoritarian, which is what I thought in the beginning. That's an interesting case. Okay, so and they have very little interest in restorative justice, indeed. So when I talked to a police colonel here, Colonel Fernandez, who's been in the police for 25 years, he told me this when we're talking about lynchings, about like my research, which by the way is not linked at all with the Brazilian police in this regard. It's a completely independent research. He told me that, he said, we try to find the criminals before the people do. The strongest law in poor community is the lex talionis. It's an eye for an eye. So, and he has told me incredibly harsh stories about the social punishment, which go much, much beyond what we expect any reasonable sense of restorative justice. And then we can mention that. So, psychology experiments also suggest that proximity and knowledge are poor substitutes for the desire of revenge. Dictator games consistently show that players prefer to make zero profits than allowing others to make most of the gains. A dictator game works as follows. So we have two people, and one of the persons decides how much money he or she is going to take and how much money the other person is going to get. But the second person, player B, decides if she accepts it or not. So if A says, okay, I'm going to get, say, like 99 for me, 1 for you. If person B says no, no one gets anything. But the rational thing to do, at least from an economic point of view, is for this person to get 99, this one to get 1, because 1 is better than nothing. So everyone will be better off, but almost everyone refuses this. So they prefer to lose any type of money that they would get in order to punish the first one for being unjust. Okay, so, and the effect is larger for players in less industrialized countries. So the more rural the society is, for instance, the worse the punishment is. So society goes much beyond the severity of the crime. As I mentioned before, it also serves a symbolic purpose. So Gambetta shows how criminals use mutilations to send signals to third parties, and Martins discusses how lynchings have the main purpose of dehumanizing the victim, not to punish the crime per se. Okay, the idea is to blur the difference between humans and other animals, indeed. Okay. That's how you attack the body so strongly. So, reducing incarceration with deterrence policies. If prison abolition is difficult at the moment, maybe other policies can help. Then we can use to foster the discussion. The most widely known is to decriminalize minor offenses, which again, I think that a lot of people would agree with that, with illegal gambling, drug use, traffic violations, and so on. The deterrence policies also seem to work pretty well, even for serious crimes. That's indeed even how prison gangs operate. When they say like, well, the punishment is so harsh that people don't do it don't violate the law often, indeed. So gangs also pose an example where deterrence policies actually work. Okay, so they are based on the threat of sanctions rather than the punishment itself. So Becker was the first one to formulate the new version of the theories. Gary Becker, an economist, got a Nobel Prize, either in 2002, something like that. He formulated that. So in a recent systematic review, so as far as we know, deterrence policies work pretty well, and they're associated with statistically significant effects. The effects particularly large for variants that try to dissuade groups to engage in violence, which is by far the most serious problem in incarceration, which those with serious crimes. So I think they should be brought into attention in the next debate. So they do not argue to abolish prisons per se, but their effect might lead to a reduction in incarceration rates, which is of course a very positive effect. Okay, so the terrorist seems to work even in situations where the state is not present or in countries which had suffered civil wars. Chris Blackman shows that with an experiment in Liberia. So while the terrorist seems to fall short of the expectations of prison abolitionists, it may serve as a good start. At least we can use that to bring the discussion to a wider public. I think it's probably a good idea. So just like to close up so then we can open for discussions. I have a few humble suggestions on how to move the prison abolition discussion forward. How can we do that? So it's a very noble goal. Again, prison abolitionism is a great idea, but it might not be feasible at the moment. Okay, so how can we do? One of the issues is to tackle more seriously the problem of hard crimes, serious crimes, which is probably the most difficult part of the normative argument. So how can we deal with very serious criminals? So the current evidence indicates that societies without prisons, such as incarcerated people in prison gangs, vigilante groups, or societies who live very far away from capitalist modes of production, they have very violent means of solving conflict, which are often worse than incarceration. And indeed, I strongly respect that the argument that incarceration is a horrible thing indeed, but lynchings are definitely one of the most brutal types of social punishment that we could get, and they become even more widespread when we do not have access to the state as a mediator of conflict. So the demand for punishment is real. It's not only that we have a top-down approach where, say, the state is increasing the prison industrial complex because it wants to follow a certain capitalist logic, but there's a very strong popular demand for it. And then we have to address it seriously if you want to reduce the incarceration rates or if you want to change how prisons are governed in many senses. Okay, so other policies, again, may reduce incarceration rates more rapidly, and they should probably be brought into discussion too. They might be a first stepping stone for a bigger goal. Okay, so a few ideas indeed. So maybe prison abolition should be understood as an unfinished movement, and that's a fine idea. So, and thus conceive itself as the struggles of being unending without finality. That's pretty much what democracy is. Democracy is an unfinished project, and then we accept that. So maybe prison abolition should be seen as this type as such concept. Okay, so we know that we're not going to achieve it, but we have to fight for it anyway. So while the approach is probably unsatisfying, it can equate some of the demands with the hard questions indeed, such as serious crimes. So again, it's a goal which may not be feasible, but that's something we strive for. Okay, so historical examples where prisons were abolished or they were non-existent, they would also illuminate the case a bit further. And I would love to read more about that. So prison abolitionists using, say, like how gangs regulate behavior, how other communities where prison cannot be used can also regulate behavior in a less harmful way than the state does. Okay, that's super important. We can have something like this. So abolitionists can also look for low-hanging fruits in criminology, in sociology, or economics. So many policies that have strong evidence in their favor might also help to reduce incarceration. Maybe they're just not more widespread because the public doesn't know about that. So, so that's probably one of the things that we can tackle. Okay, so tackling the demand for punishment is hard, and sometimes the top-down approach is actually more effective. So, in his book about death penalty in the US, Garland mentions that the abolition of death penalty was indeed a counter-majoritarian reform imposed with limited popular support and usually in direct contravention of majority public opinion. We have a theory in international relations we call the democratic peace. It comes from Kant, which basically says that two democracies will not go to war one with another because people do not want violence. Okay, it's because authoritarian leaders want violence, then countries go to war. That's not the case. If you run a survey, say like with members of the public, indeed, and with elites are far more peaceful than most of the members of the public. So a lot of citizens are much more willing to engage in aggressive behavior towards other nations than members of the elite. So maybe it works better if we have a top-down approach than a bottom-up. It might. Okay? We can have no idea, but just it might. So, and activists have found that support from groups across the IO, it's very useful indeed. So, and I'm pretty sure that say like libertarians are very much in favor of this argument. So we were talking about like David Friedman some time ago. So they're very much in favor. Yes, but yeah, mass public support might be a bit hard to get. Indeed. So the challenges are not small, indeed, but that's what we have to face. So we have to engage in those questions, indeed, if we want to move to a place beyond return. So with that said, I thank you very much for your time and for your attention. And if you want to get in touch, again, please let me know. Send me an email, either for Gmail or through Brown. Here's my website. And all the slides are going to be available at this link on GitHub. So feel free to download them, use them, and do whatever, share them, do whatever you want. Okay, so with that said, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. And I'm waiting for your questions, and let's have a very nice discussion.
Wonderful. Oh my God, thank you so much. That's amazing. So fascinating. Okay, well, I've got tons of things I want to say, but I'm going to hold back. So I think I will cancel Spotlight. Still recording. Okay, anyone want to kick off with discussion? Feel free to. I think we're small enough that we can probably butt in, or feel free to use the hands however you like.
Can I ask a question, Serena?
Go ahead, Charles. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Danilo. That was really, really fascinating. I had a question for you. I wonder whether, you know, this may seem quite trivial, but I've always found the word prison to actually be a very primitive word, this notion of imprisoning our fellow human beings. And it reminds me of this use of the word workhouse in the 19th century where orphan children went to go. And of course, we don't talk about workhouses these days. Our attitudes towards you know, children who may be orphan or have no parents has completely changed since the 19th century when it was you know, the situation for them was terrible. And I wonder whether the same thing is true of prisons. Instead of talking about imprisoning our fellow human beings, we should instead just rethink what we're trying to do, which may be to temporarily remove some people from the mainstream of society because they're a danger to themselves and potentially to other human beings. But instead of this concept of putting them in a building and imprisoning them, it's not so much about abolishing prisons, but thinking differently about the institutions which are used to help these people out. And again, that may seem a trivial suggestion, but it's always struck me it's an important psychological step for society to stop talking about imprisoning people, which seems to me a very ancient and sort of backward way of thinking about what we should do with people who have committed some sort of crimes, and just rethink the way we consider our fellow human beings. Do you think that sort of thing could go some way to making progress? A simple psychological change in the way in which we think about temporarily removing some people from the mainstream of society?
Thanks very much, Charles. Yes, and I think so. Yes, absolutely. There will be a change on the margins of incarceration, which I strongly agree that might be effective, mainly for minor crimes. And I think that this psychological change might help. What I'm not sure, indeed, is how would people react with this type of change for crimes that are strongly offensive against morality. So I strongly believe that if you say honestly, we have to understand how we are treating our fellow human beings for very petty crimes, and which in the UK or in the US, they might even constitute the majority of people who are currently in prisons. But I don't think it solves the case for the very difficult question that is, people do have a demand for punishment, and I'm not so sure how we can change it psychologically as so easily. Again, in some of the cases, we see that the courts and even the police, they are trying to take care of prisoners better than other prisoners themselves are. For instance, I don't know how it is, again, exactly the case in the US, but in many Latin American countries, prison staff, they intentionally remove, for instance, rapists and other types of criminals from specific modes of incarceration because they know that they're going to be killed by fellow inmates. So, and in this point, I'm not so sure how we can change this mentality of what are we going to do with them if the for instance, how we can satisfy this craving for justice in this regard. And that's a question which I don't know. I'm literally leaving it open to all of us. If people have a craving for punishment, how can we solve that? Do you believe that if we just change, again, like the view, how people interact with one another, would that be enough? I'm not sure. I think it is, but I would like to know more about it. Please.
Go ahead, Charles. Go ahead, Charles.
No, I didn't. I don't really have anything to say. I think that's a really interesting point. I don't know what you do about very, very serious crimes. Merely changing the name of a prison to something else isn't necessarily going to satisfy people, or make the environment better for the people who have committed the crimes, or assuage the demand from the victims as well. It's an interesting problem.
One thing I wanted to clock was, Seth, I see your hand up. So the data that you showed, Danilo, on the dictator game suggests that that something is modulated, right? The industrialization, and so I think my understanding of the abolition movement is not to say that we should abolish prisons. It is to say that we should abolish the society that requires prisons as the solution. And that data does suggest that if you were to change maybe abundance of access to resources or wealth or whatever it is that we think we're measuring in industrialization there, that the sort of like thirst for revenge might be shifted. Seth, go ahead.
I know a libertarian articulation of what some of the folks on this side are up to would be to say that you could have competition for justice systems, satisfy the demands for harsh punishment through the typical system, but allow people to opt out of it for alternative justice systems. But that's not my comment. I wanted to kind of argue, you're making, I know the signaling theory of punishment, and I like Gambetta's work a lot, but I see it as a theoretical argument. It's a proposed theory. You're giving it a lot of credence and disqualifying alternative explanations, a little bit mistaking the map for the territory, I feel like. And that goes all the way. Of course, deterrence theory falls straight out of signaling, but you're not considering that commitment to theory you're demonstrating, you're not really totally following through on it. Because as far as, I mean, I'd love to be wrong here, but what instrumentation does signaling theory have to avoid death penalty for jaywalking? And how much are we just kind of cherry picking the instances where deterrence does reduce incarceration and ignoring the cases? I mean, I guess I don't really know the literature on 3 strikes, but at least the popular narrative is that it's increased incarceration, and it's justified on deterrence grounds. And then you're also downplaying culture. You're kind of taking demand for harsh punishment to be static, ignoring that there's mutual causation here. That policy and policy can change culture, and culture can change demand. And I would hypothesize that there's a lot of variation in demand for harsh punishment by country, for example.
That's true. So let me start with the last point, and then we move to the first one. That's true. There is indeed a lot of variation in that. There are a few things that we can test. Of course, we can measure how people have like attitudes toward that, and then you're right that they vary over time. We have become less and less tolerant of violence in many cases. But for instance, if you interview even countries which are strongly peaceful in many senses, such as the Scandinavian countries. And the research that has been done regarding treatment of terrorists, for instance, people are extremely harsh against them as well. And then we also have very strong evidence that in-group violence is sometimes less serious than out-group violence. And then psychological evidence shows that pretty much like consistently too. And I'm not so sure how we can deal with a world without prisons, and if you leave, society itself punished though. And then another problem which I have with restorative justice is that the victim of the first crime, he or she might simply not accept or not want to have any type of restorative justice. And this is not taken into a regard, because usually someone has to enforce the law to force those two people to agree with restorative justice, because someone has to accept that to begin with. And sometimes you might not. And then who's going to force you to accept restorative justice if you don't want to? Someone else has to enforce this power over you. Please, Zorina, you raised your hand. Sorry.
Just to say, yes, my understanding is restorative justice should always be voluntary and consensual. So I do a lot of restorative justice, and often that's not something people want. And in that situation, we move to transformative justice, which is that we say, okay, we will work to try and transform the conditions that led to your harm, and you don't have to participate in that in any way. You can sort of move on. But I just wanted to touch on Seth's point about competition for justice systems. So like this is really, I think, something really interesting. So many of us in this community steward a project called the Alternative Justices Project, which seeks to provide alternatives. It is a consensual project that works with people who have been accused or admitted to harming others to shift their behavior. But two things that I often hear from people I think are worth sharing here. One is that one thing is that it is often the case that people say, I'm here with you voluntarily engaging in this alternative justice process because the alternative is so much worse. So there's always this threat or this competition, as Seth says, between the alternative is prosecution and these like awful things and certainly a social death. So there seems like there's like maybe this role for like always having something worse. But that does help us like move to something better, right? If there's like, so you could imagine a role for like some terrible heinous system that hopefully we never ever use, but it's just there as a way to sort of move us to this other system. And then the other thing that I hear people say often, which I don't know what to do with, is something along the lines of, in some ways a punishment would be easier because I could just take the punishment and be done with it. You take your pound of flesh and then I get to start again. But this process with Zorina is really, really hard because it just goes on and on forever. And I never know when it's finished. And so there's just two sort of nuggets that I think are interesting to think about when we're talking about like the demand for violence doesn't just come from like the top, doesn't just come from, it sometimes comes from those on the other end too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So we have like many stories of say like cycles of violence that indeed we start say like with one case which leads to a series of vendettas and they basically never stop. Yes, that's the case. So the case for say like competing systems, that's absolutely true, and it's a valid solution as long as the society has the resources to do so, because they are expensive. Yeah. So like the more competition you want to have, by definition, you are spending more resources. Like violence is one of the very few cases in which monopoly is the most cost-effective decision. That's why we don't have like civil wars all the time, because the monopoly of force is indeed less costly than competing systems. Again, so we need some surplus to be able to do so. And in poor communities, this may or may not be a viable solution. I hope it is, but I'm skeptical that it will work in very poor places. Many, in some wealthy ones, probably people would be able to access this type of different systems. Please.
Just a few things. One, Zarina, I'm actually self-punishment.
Oh, we lost you there. Can you say that again?
Sorry, yes, I didn't hear. Sorry.
Yeah, start again.
We're going to turn the video off because I think our internet is funky.
That's okay, sure.
Okay. But a few things. Firstly, I'm not surprised in response to people wanting to opt in for punishment, like self-punishment, Zarina, in that case, because one, it's easier in the sense that, like, I think in order to face the crime, it requires a lot of moving through really probably painful life experiences and trauma, and also confronting and grappling with a really complex world in ways that, like, you know, so it's definitely seems more difficult. And, you know, there seems to be a fascination with, and I was talking about this before you had brought up the, like, demand for violence. I was like, well, our society has a fascination with punishment and violence for self and other. Like, I think that there's
Sorry?
We lost you, Taylor.
I lost you a little bit. I'm super sorry.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
We lost you after fascination for violence.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying, I wanted to contribute to the conversation about what we do about this demand for violence, and something that, like, I'm feeling into a little bit is it being a very animalistic, like being tied to a very animalistic instinct and, like, evolutionary mechanism, and being very visceral, this, like, need for punishment or violence. And I think that one thing that, I don't know if this is possible right at this moment, it's obviously a systemic issue, and more than a systemic issue, I think it's well, I think systemically as humans, we kind of deny or turn away from or shame our base instincts, or these, like, animalistic instincts that we have out of shame, or like, oh, that's wrong, you shouldn't, or whatever it is. And then
Oh, I'm sorry. Like, I think we lost you.
Economic. I think where Taylor was going was that, is that, like, you know, we constantly shift the culture of our attitudes towards things.
Yeah, and I think too, like, something that I think might be helpful in maybe lowering the demand for violence or addressing it is starting with, like, an educational kind of perspective, really acknowledging the instinct of violence exists in people, and being able to acknowledge that, look at that, talk about it as a culture, as a society. When we educate children, like, there needs to be a totally unlearning process, or just a new learning process for people, you know, children that are coming up, that helps them understand what they are and how to communicate and relate to themselves and others in a way that isn't competitive, but more so, like, collaborative and, like, compassionate and understanding. I think that there needs to be, like, a new way of relating to ourselves and the world and other people, and that will help with the demand for violence if we understand that, like, oh, this is an instinct we all feel, or, you know, this is the reason this is here, and how we approach that feeling. Like, I think it's just a different way of enculturating people into understanding themselves and what we are, eventually.
Thank you so much. I think it's a fascinating point, and that's indeed, like, overlooked in many discussions. So evolutionary biologists, they have been very eager to point out that our closest relatives, the other primates, they're extremely aggressive, and not only towards themselves but towards other species, like the chimpanzees. So they're very, very aggressive animals. So they have extremely high rates of intentional deaths and so on. So there may be something slightly deeper than that. Again, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so I'm not going to make a strong claims about it. But I do think that it's an extremely hard problem to solve, and then it might not only be that we do not have the right institutions to do so. And we might need probably a much stronger thing to deal nicely with that. If you take a very long run perspective, we are indeed like much less violent than we used to. That's for sure. So the number of deaths at Oxford, they were mostly the same as we have in the worst parts of Brazil today. So what they had like 300 years ago, more or less. So homicide rate in Oxford, like I don't know, like 35 or 40 deaths per 100,000, which of course Oxford is one of the most peaceful cities in the world today. So things can get better indeed, but I'm not so sure if you can satisfy this. There may be something even bigger than just a cultural differences than that. Yeah.
Just before Charles, I see your hand up. I just want to say, as I understand it, there is a theory that suggests that if we had discovered bonobos before we had discovered chimps, we would have very different ideas about human behavior, both violent and sexual behavior. We seem to share about the same of our genome with bonobos and chimps, and bonobos are much less violent and have forward-facing sex and all sorts of things. Anyway, Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, just following on from that, that's a really interesting comment about the biology. I just wonder whether, are there examples of people I mean, you showed your very nice examples of vigilante groups and prison gangs. Are there any examples of societies at any point in the history of civilization over the last 10,000 years where very serious crimes have not resulted in serious violence to the perpetrator? Is there any value in looking back through history to see whether societies have managed to find a way around this, or has this been a universal trait for all types of societies since the birth of settled civilization about 10,000 years ago? Is there any value in looking back through time to see how people have dealt with this? Or even today, I'm thinking, the Inuit of the high Arctic or kibbutzim. I mean, are there examples of societies that have managed to find a solution to this?
Yes, absolutely. So indeed, well, like the ancient Greeks, they usually have like ostracism. So the people just removed from society for if I'm not wrong, for 8 years, but then you were allowed to come back to the city, and they were completely free after that, which is a very different way of understanding that.
So these things work quite well, right, with small societies. I mean, I think the Inuit also do shaming and banishment from society if you commit crimes. But of course, that doesn't really work in a society of tens of millions. Well, it might work in a society of tens of millions. Maybe it's a good idea, but of course, it's not probably going to be very, very effective as a way of dealing with those sorts of crimes in very large societies. Yeah. So I suppose there's an issue here also of the scale of society and on what sort of responses work for different sizes of society. Yeah.
Absolutely. And exit is a very difficult thing to do. For instance, one of the classic problems with dictators is what do we do with them? And then one of the issues that we have is that they don't have any exit. Why? Because, of course, dictators have usually been extremely brutal towards their population. So they know that when they leave power, they're probably going to be put to death, as has historically been the case if they lose power. So one of the main issues is that why don't we have a safe harbor for dictators, say like somewhere? Why don't you just go and send, say, like a brutal dictator to Saudi Arabia? So then he or she is going to be like better off in one way, but then the country that he or she governs is also going to be better off to a large extent. So, but that's, I don't know if that's a very popular measure. How could we like ostracize, say, like people in all the societies, and where would you take them to?
Well, just yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just to think idealistically, of course, this has a lot of historical baggage, the idea of sending people away, because normally they get treated badly, like British penal colonies. But what would happen if you did have a modern version of that was actually pleasant, where you had an area of the world where people who had committed terrible crimes would go, but they'd be treated very well and educated, and maybe tried to give them an opportunity to come back into society. And it could be a UN-agreed place in the world. A bit like Israel, you would create a whole new state somewhere for people that have committed serious crimes, and they would have a good time there and have the opportunity to go back to their country. So a sort of modern version of ostracism without the bad treatment. Maybe that's idealistic, but maybe something radical like that would be the way to approach this.
Absolutely. I think it's a wonderful idea, like to send like people like somewhere would have like nice amenities and so on. Your ex-Safis just mentioned that Napoleon went to the very posh island. That's absolutely true. He spent like a nice years like in holidays, like over there. Indeed. So the problem is with moral hazards. So the problem is moral hazard indeed. So you have the people who committed serious crimes and then they go to a very nice place. And we still have poor people in the country who did not commit any crime, who live in worse conditions. The problem is, how can we justify that? Again, it might be a very interesting idea, but it's probably going to be from it should probably be a top-down approach, because if you put it, I don't know, into any type of election, it's going to be a very hard sell. So okay, so a criminal goes to a place when they have all the amenities, and I still live in a favela. So, well, yes.
Well, it could be a place where they're treated nicely, but it's not necessarily a place where people want to go. I mean, the moon might be a good place to do this, where they do something productive, they're treated well, so it's not a penal colony, but it's not necessarily a place where poor people would necessarily want to go themselves. So there's a sort of balance between giving them good treatment, but having a place that people wouldn't feel aggrieved by the fact they've got this opportunity. Although some people like me would feel aggrieved if they went to the moon and I didn't go, but that's not a matter.
Jesse,
I just want to throw out there. Sorry, hi, Olson.
Hi, Olson, and then Jesse after you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry, I should have raised my hand or something.
So I see you in a car.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know a lot about it, but in the Old Testament, people were just asking about old versions of this, and I think there's a lot of instances in the Old Testament where banishment and exile are the prescriptive sort of punishment. So that's just to touch on something that's ancient.
For sure.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, two quick questions. One was just about I forget what the formal term for this is, but I totally understand why your research focused on kind of the more formal gang context, and it makes me wonder if we're kind of missing a bunch of what could potentially be other responses to harm and violence inside prisons that just wouldn't be captured by those particular groups. So it's sort of like something like the false negatives or something like that. But and I have no idea what one would do about that, but that just sort of came up for me listening to your work, which was very, very interesting, and I learned a lot. So thank you for the presentation. And then the other question was similarly to Charles. Like, I feel like this might be a kind of almost boring or lame or like cheesy suggestion, but to the extent that there are not restorative responses inside, in incarcerated environments or otherwise, I wonder if it's just because people haven't been exposed to the tools for them. So are there any programs that we are aware of or could think about deploying that are around, different responses, like, whether it's NVC or facilitation techniques or, I don't know, I sort of feel silly at the idea of a bunch of people sitting in a classroom being taught, like, how to facilitate like mediated responses to violence in that kind of environment. But on the other hand, I don't have a better suggestion. So just throwing it out there.
Well, thanks very much, Jesse, for the two comments. Regarding the first one, so don't we have like other solutions apart from prison gangs to deal with problems of incarceration? Well, prison gangs are quite a somewhat of recent phenomena. They basically started in the 50s in the US, in the 50s and 60s, precisely because prisons were too large to be self-governed. And so when the numbers of incarcerated people are increased so much, they need a more formal organization, because just informal rules that they had before, which was, people usually call it the convict code. So those people were not in use anymore. One of the issues that they had was that the code has to be shared and agreed upon by many people so that it could work. That's how informal societies work. But then we have such a large number of newcomers to the prison system that they simply didn't share the rules, and they didn't know about them, or they might not agree with them. So gangs were born to reduce collective action problems, indeed. So you centralize the control of this authority in a sort of community-based system. For instance, in some societies, we have a community-based system more or less like this. So someone from your community does something wrong. You have from being a member of the community, you have better information about who did it and why did it. So you punish the person in your community to make sure that my community does not affect yours. So it was an idea to just discuss. So in large prisons, it's very, very difficult not to have a gang operating there. So it's really, really hard. Even in Norway and in Sweden, where the prison population is much, much smaller, they still have some prison gangs, even in Sweden. Of course, they are not at all as violent as in many other places in the world, but they still like organized in a sense. And regarding your second point, so why don't we try something like this? Perhaps I am not familiar with the literature, so I'm very humble and say that I don't know of any effect of things like this that might have happened. I'm also, indeed, I also feel a bit bad when I mention that. I said, okay, so let's give a lecture to those people who have been through extremely hard times and they have been educated in violence, and then let's go and tell them that that's not what they were supposed to do. It's hard, indeed. So I remember once that I met a few members of an international organization who were trying to help like a Brazilian women organize. And they said, no, I completely understand it. And so because they don't do X and Y and Z. And like my first question was like, they have been living this life for decades. Probably they have thought about it, but they couldn't do it. So like, it's not that they don't know how. I think the most difficult part is how can we make this a project like feasible. I don't know, but again, I'm talking about something which I'm not very familiar with. I appreciate any comments that you may have. Probably much better than mine. Thank you.
Jesse, do you want to respond?
No, thank you. That's great. But please go ahead.
Jesse's meanwhile started a prison gang in the chat.
Yes, that's what I was saying, because like I would be interested to know, I mean, just to kind of back up on Jesse's comments that you made in the chat. You mentioned that a few of the prison groups actually do have something like a constitution. So I would love to know if you can speak a little bit about the rules. And you mentioned that they were quite violent, but was there anything else that would almost resemble something like a restorative justice approach? Like, were there any constitutions that you read of those prison gangs that?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, in case anybody else who has
the second thing.
Oh, sorry. Am I slow, or I'll just, in case anybody can hear me, if there's anybody on the call who has been in incarcerated environments who can speak to their experience of the like code of those gangs, that would also be really interesting for me.
Please do it. Yes, absolutely. Please.
I suppose I'm the only one here.
So please.
Well, I don't want to just jump in if somebody else wants to continue their thought.
Nope, hit it.
Okay. Hi, my name is Bert, and I'm formerly incarcerated. I was incarcerated 20 years for second-degree murder that I committed when I was 17 years old. I started my journey thinking that you know, I was never going to be released from prison again, that I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison. So my situation is one of those serious categories. But prior to that, I learned criminal behavior. I grew up in an environment where I've been stealing since a very early age. I learned how to fight as a result of that. So violence and trying to survive and all of these negative behaviors that I adopted, it met my needs over time. I mean, at that time, excuse me. So being incarcerated is, you know, it's an interesting experience, to say the least. Everything that you described in your presentation, I've observed, I guess, boots on the ground. It was interesting seeing that picture of those guys locked up, the 18th Street Cats. Yeah, I was on the other side of that cage, so it was like so interesting being on this perspective and having sat with some of those guys, not personally, but I'm just saying, like, being on the other side of that cage and being accepted. The difficulties of culturally, what's different about my situation is that I'm white presenting. So there's like this segregation of amongst race of white, black, whatever, and I fell under the category of other because I grew up in an Asian background, and so I think that's probably why my prison experience is much more, I wouldn't say unique, but just different from others, because I didn't have to play the prison politics. I was within this environment, but I didn't have to. I did play by the rules, but I wasn't so entrenched that that I had to adopt it. I have no tattoos on my body. I don't have any swastikas on me. I don't have any of these things that that's attached to it. And so, but I am also limited by my the resources that I had growing up. I realized that there was a need to learn and to observe. And in my journey, I started to look around at the folks around me in the environment that I was at, and I realized that I wanted more. I wanted more for my life. I started to realize my potential and that I could give so much more. And so what wound up happening is I just started to observe and start focusing on my basic skills, learning how to communicate, adapting, all of these skills that, hello?
Keep going.
It's creating an echo. Sorry. So I just wanted to say what I observed was, security is a need in prison. And it was interesting hearing you guys talk about like bartering cigarettes and things of that nature, because like I've observed these things, and what you could add to the list is like clean linens and like underwear and cosmetics and bars of soap and stuff like that. All of that has a form of value that is exchanged. And something that I realized that when I was incarcerated is the reason why these groups develop is because of there's a need for safety, and safety is the currency. If it boils down to, if you follow these rules, this is how we all stay safe. And it's kind of like a resource that is taken away and given. And if you follow these rules, then you'll be safe. And so in that way, it's kind of valuable like a currency, it's exchanged. And granted that you have these environments that are like fish in a barrel, so we're all limited by our intelligence, by our knowledge. But it's such a weird byproduct that these things kind of develop naturally, that there's a microcosm of economy where people are trying to like maneuver and and create these things within this environment, so I'm sorry, I'm just going over some of the notes that I heard. I mean, there was a whole bunch of them. I mean, my mind was just going everywhere as far as like racist matrix, incarceration matrix that's happening. That's like I'm observing the contrasting the differences between being inside and being outside, and how there's some similarities. I want to speak a little bit about this culture of punishment. I think what's happening is the system created like the prison, right? And the prison created like and fostered a lot of these social gangs that created the constructs that's happening. And I think that what's happening and why a system is so broken is because there is this detachment from that top-down thing that you were describing. And I see it happening all the time, that people want the trash removed, but they don't want to participate in how that trash is being removed. So it's kind of the same thing. If I'm a taxpayer and I really care about public safety, then I'll pay my taxes, and then however public safety is administered. And because of that detachment, it's creating this brokenness in the system. Yeah, I mean, that's just some of the observations that I mean. I don't want to take up too much time, but
so I think we had Alison and then Ocean.
No, this was perfect. Ocean, you go. I'm really happy to see you.
Just a quick note. I think so. Someone earlier was talking about starting nonviolent communication programs in prison. I tried really hard to make that happen, and I found in the prison I was at that there was actually a video collection of them, and I pushed really hard to get approved, and all the bureaucrats shuffled around. Eventually, the videos disappeared mysteriously, and so yeah, I just thought it was funny that was suggested because I tried really hard and they were not having it. They did not want to do the. I think it's mostly just laziness. It's just bureaucratic, like they just want the paycheck, a lot of these workers, and anything that creates extra work for them. They're like, no, another class. We got plenty of classes. We don't need another class. So yeah, I thought that was funny. Just funny.
Do you think RDAP could? Do you think RDAP could fulfill some of the roles or not at all?
Some of RDAP uses some nonviolent communication stuff. Yeah, they do. I think, at least it reminds me of some of the tools that I remember. In RDAP, there's the official curriculum, and then there's what the drug treatment specialists bring in from their own kind of, what they're into. And I remember doing exercises where you talk about, use I feel languages and other things that I recognize from nonviolent communication. But so yeah, RDAP does do that a little bit. RDAP's got a lot of great stuff, but it's just the main messed up thing about the program is that there's just unaccountable bureaucrats that can take away your year at any time just because they don't like you. It has nothing to do with your participation in the program or how reformed you're being. If you don't get along with one of the drug treatment specialists, they can make you do an extra year in prison. So that's the main problem with that program. But the actual substances, there's a lot of great tools, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy and stuff.
I have a question that is a bit tangential, so I don't want to disturb the flow. Charles, you got a question, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Engelbert, you talked about the disconnection between the public and prisons and the fact that people pay over their taxes and they just want the problem dealt with. I wonder whether do you think there could be improvement made just by enhancing the number of, for example, teachers working in prisons? I know that when we set up our program with the Scottish Prison Service, it actually took us a lot of work to get into prisons. Even when we were volunteering to start a new program in prisons, a new educational program, we actually had to work quite hard to win the trust and go into the prisons and do our work. And we eventually got there. Now we're running our program. But it surprised me there was such a barrier to interacting with the incarcerated population and getting involved in training. I just wonder whether you think that, breaking that down and enhancing the number of even secondary school teachers or conventional teachers going into the prison environment, doing teaching in there, and just enhancing this flow back and forwards between the incarcerated environment and the educational environment and the rest of society would help to break down that barrier and improve the connection between both communities. Or do you think that's a fairly sort of trivial suggestion?
No, I think the difficulty is that the system is making so much money off of prisons. It's turning into something what Danilo was describing with about the prison industrial complex and how much money is involved in this thing. And now this is what modern day slavery it is, because I observed it. When I was 6 years into my sentence, I realized that these folks didn't care that I was locked up. They didn't, I was started making changes in my life when I was 26, 27, and I was ready to play ball. I was like, yeah, let's do this. I could, there's so much things I could do with myself, and we could help others, and just getting into this really strong community oriented mindset. And they didn't give a shit about that. They only cared about keeping things the way they are because these folks want to get paid. It's so frustrating, and I don't want to sound negative, but it's connected with this American philosophy. I want to get paid the most with doing the least amount of work. These folks have GED educations and they get $100,000 paychecks, and and that's for the smallest person in the rung in their ladder, and you want to mess with that? No, get out of here. You're messing with our money. You know, we don't care. We want to keep this thing going. We don't care that you commit these crimes. We want you to keep committing crimes because that justifies our paychecks. And it's negative and it's frustrating, but that's what it boils down to. And then of course the politicians are going to come from this angle and say, yeah, we need public safety and blah 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 and restorative justice and have these things from here. Of course they can't. It's like that's why they create that resistance, right? They create this resistance because then it's like they can't have an overarching policy blatantly having. It's just like, I know that I'm hitting at something sinister, but it's just, you're messing with folks' money, and that's why Charles, that's why you're probably meeting that resistance. And then also there's also the cultural stuff that with Danilo. I'm not going to say that it's just one blanket policy thing. There are also the resistance from within. It's like, it's something that folks don't want to change sometimes, and then you have this entity that preys upon that, right? It's like it's not an entity that's created to for change. It's just an entity that's created to keep going, you know.
So I get your point about the profit motive creating this separation and everything you've just said. The Scottish Prison Service is interesting because although there are 2 private prisons in Scotland, the rest is publicly funded. But there's still this sense that the public don't want to know what happens in prisons, and they pay their taxes. The prisons get run by the government. There's no profit motive in it, but there's still this barrier between the prisons and the rest of the population. You have to work to get into a prison to offer an education program, even without that profit motive. So I can see the profit motive makes a lot stronger motivation for creating this disconnection, but my sense is it's even there in a state-run, government-run prison system. The Scottish prison system is actually pretty open-minded with respect to education and offering education programs. But even there, there's a separation. It's really interesting what you say. Yeah, thank you.
Well, the reason why I'll just hint on this: CCPOA, one of the strongest prison lobbyists in California. They have so much power, and they have so much power that they actually dictate the prison culture, and that they control it. So it makes you wonder, like, if they have so much power and they want things this way, they want to keep things this way, and so I understand that there's a difference between Scottish prisons and California and stuff like that. I'm just hinting at yeah, I mean, honestly, I can't really say how it is in Scotland. I can only say how it is in California,
Yeah, it's not a similar problem between both systems, so it's interesting. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Before we close out, I just wanted to touch on something. So I think there's something interesting in this data. So Danilo, you present this data about the dictator game, and you suggest that there's differences across different nation states or societies. And I want to try and reconcile that with the data that suggests that people who have more money or more wealthy act more selfishly. I don't know if you've seen this data that people who have more expensive cars tend to speed up at a red light and then slow down, tend to take more from a sort of like cookie jar, and that's supposed to be for children, blah 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 blah, goes on and on. And I think the data have also suggested that you can artificially make people wealthy, and they will start to behave in accordance with that also. So there's like this sort of conflicting data which seems to tell us that the material circumstances in which decisions are made changes all this stuff. And to Seth's point, which I think is I don't know if you can see in the comments, but is often theory is used to describe or excuse the way things are, rather than thinking about the way things could be. So I think we love to look at things like the 2 monkeys paid unequally and be like, look, classic example of why we just cannot, we can't have this. But we also love to look at the rats that free each other when the other one's being punished. And, and so we're also like, oh yeah, look, great evidence that mammals are inherently kind. And so I think we sort of have this bias to both look at the way we are rather than the way we could be, and also to sort of use animal literature to sort of justify things in a sort of slightly lazy way. And so I wonder why it is that we don't study the examples where these things are happening. So there are places where they've abolished the police. There are places where they have instigated, got rid in prisons. There are places where they have, people have taken, I think I posted one example in Mexico, where the village people sort of rose up against cartels, politicians, and the police to create their own system, and have reduced the amount of like village decapitation tremendously in the last couple of years. And so there are examples, and I wonder why we're not studying these examples as much as maybe we're studying the sort of default systems. So open question.
I think it's a great point indeed. A few things. One, yes, confirmation bias is also always like very complicated. Of course, we want to find convenient data sets that fit our narrative. I agree. That's why looking at just one specific data point is always like complicated. So like the more I see like quantitative studies, the more I believe that even systematic reviews and meta-analysis, even them are slightly flawed. So we should take them with a grain of salt. And it's like, why don't we look at these societies? And then, for instance, why don't we look more at the bonobos, or why don't we look more at the like Mexican groups? Maybe we should. Maybe they are not so well known, and then we might just not know that they are there. So then allow me to make a joke. So then, we need better PR. Then we need to show like best what we can do. So that's like some of the tasks that we have to do, like ourselves. One of the suggestions that I strongly have, if someone has those cases, and if they think they can make a very good point for them, use them more often. So I would like to read more empirical cases of prison abolitionism, and not only like theoretical arguments. The theoretical arguments I buy, but it's good to me to find how they work. So again, any counterexample, like if someone can have like an edited book with all those cases, it would be
Wouldn't that be great? Maybe we should do that. Yeah. So another example that I went to visit myself a few years ago is a place in south of Spain called Marinaleda, where they have basically provided free access to housing, work, and a basic income, and they eliminated the police some years ago. And I don't know what they have put in place. Right, so the story they have is that they have like significantly reduced harm because everyone just has a relatively good life. But who knows, really, right? That like it'd be really interesting to go and study some of these. So maybe we'll start collecting examples. Okay, I want to be careful about time. So anyone got any last comments or questions they want to put to Danilo? I will also make sure that we're all in a shared digital space after this, so we can keep these conversations going. But if anyone's got any last thoughts or comments or questions. No.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been so wonderful. Yeah.
That's very nice. That was really great. So thanks everyone for their comments, for their suggestions, for their different points of view, for the very nice discussion that we had today. Honestly, I'm very much surprised. I'm positively surprised by the level of discussion. And I really want to meet you guys again very soon. It was a pleasure.
Oh, great! We have to come and stay. Lots of us live together.
Oh, that's very nice.
Thank you so much. We're already like, further debating. Has not joined us here. And we're like,
Danilo, I'll invite you to our digital city where I think everybody on this call is already, and we can carry on these conversations and hopefully collaborate in the future. Charles, did you want to chime in?
No, just thanks a lot. That was just fantastic. I really enjoyed this evening. Well, sorry, this morning for you, but.
Yep, me too. And it's really, really wonderful to have this community. And I really also appreciate your skepticism. I think this is really important. It's like we can really easily get caught up in idealist visions, and it's really important. It's easy to make things worse. And I think it's really, really, really lovely to be able to be idealistic and skeptical together. Yeah, please, if you have ideas for people that you'd love to be in conversation with, feel free to keep pinging me with other people. If you've had, if you've always been like, God, I really wish that I could have a sort of chat with that old person from blah, blah. Now that we all live on Zoom, it's the perfect time. So feel free to make suggestions. And otherwise, I will see you all next week. I think our next salon is not Beyond Prisons, it's the Beyond Speciesism track, and the next salon is on the rights of alien species, and I think that's a week today. Okay, bye everyone.